somebody who like just speaking. And I'm like,
I went there. It's good the dog hit me in the face.
Just gets a little excited.
He's a happy dog. Which one's your favorite?
Don't have one.
I know.
You like all your children the same?
No. I could have all day.
Do you think you're going to finish all five of those? Hmm? Can everyone hear us?
Yes.
Thank you. One yes, any others?
You're a little delayed.
Yeah. I'll work on that.
All right, and we're live.
We're live. Well, welcome. National Chardonnay Day. We're here at Wente Vineyards in the beautiful Livermore Valley. I'm Phil Wente, fourth generation wine grower.
And I'm Nikki Wente, fifth generation wine grower and Phil's youngest daughter.
And I'm really excited to be sitting here with Nikki. Anytime you get to spend time with your daughter is very special.
Yeah, and we also have Ernest Wente over here. And as we were mentioning earlier, if it wasn't for Ernest, we wouldn't be here today in more ways than one. He is the reason that we have Chardonnay on our property today, and he's also my dad's grandfather and my great-grandfather.
And the reason that we're here in the Livermore Valley, as California's oldest continually operating winery, my great-grandfather, Ernest's father, chose to start a winery here in 1883, 135 years ago. And along the way, they decided to start growing Chardonnay. And so that really gives us a fun opportunity to be able to be part of a Chardonnay celebration on Chardonnay Day here. And we've got a lot of Chardonnays lined up in front of us to taste. But let us give you a little background on our experience with Chardonnay before we get right into the wines. It was back in 1908 that we planted first Chardonnay and had our first harvest in 1910. And Chardonnay was a small part of the Wente family production up until Prohibition. We managed to survive Prohibition and keep the Chardonnay vineyard healthy and alive, and it was really after Prohibition when the concept of varietal labeling came into being, and we began to name all of the wines that we produced after the variety of grape from which they're grown. Chardonnay really began to become a major part of our portfolio, and as the vineyards expanded, it was the selection process that my grandfather, Ernest, over here in the picture, began to do. Each time he wanted to plant a new vineyard, he would go out and select the finest vines, the vines that had the most intense flavors at harvest and also had the best physiology, and he would mark them and check them over a period of years, and each time that he would plant a new vineyard, he would go back to those vines and make sure that he was selecting the finest vines as they expanded the vineyards. And that really brought an intensity into the Wente Chardonnay selections that was unusual in the rest of the state, and also brought a lot of attention to those vineyards where other winemakers started to come and ask if they could have selections from the Wente Chardonnay vineyards. And my grandfather was very gracious and generous and allowed winemakers from all over the state to take budwood and start their own vineyards.
Yeah, so now it's rumored that, or believed that about 80% of Chardonnay planted in California is descendant of that Wente heritage selection, that everyone was coming to our property and taking some budwood right off our property from that really great selection process that Ernest had started. And the great thing about a generational family that's been involved in the business for so many years is that these passions and these techniques are passed along from generation to generation. So it was passed from Ernest to his son and to my father, because they were all kind of working at a similar time as well, and my father on to my cousin Carl and myself. And we've been able to continue that selection process to this day, and we'll be doing it for years to come to continue that original wood selection process that we still have on our property today. So wood from 1908 and 1912, descendants of, are still on our property, never left, which is something pretty special that you don't see too many other places.
And as that selection process progressed, it really took on sort of two different attributes. There was what we call the heritage selections, which are the selections that winemakers made out of Ernest and Herman's vineyards. And then there's the selections from those vineyards that UC Davis made to take to their foundation plant material vineyard and go through a heat treatment process to create a virus-free selection that was then re-released with several different clone numbers that are widely grown throughout the state as well. So today you'll find UC Davis clones 4 and 5 widely planted from the Wente selection throughout California, as well as historical heritage selections, which are really not clones. They're because they were multi-vine selections that people took from our vineyards and planted in their vineyards, and then they did a constant selection process as well. So there's been a lot of refining of the qualities, and I think that's what makes those heritage selections very special.
Right. Yeah, and of course everything changes a little bit with the environment that it's in, but you still get those signature Wente selection traits. Some loved and some not so loved, like the hens and chicks, maybe not our favorite trait, but the delicious stone fruit, muscat, and green apple flavors that people know and love in their Chardonnay from California are present in pretty much all of that Wente selection that you can find around California.
And I should probably just touch on the fact that while we mentioned we're here in the Livermore Valley, many people may not know where the Livermore Valley is. It is a beautiful valley in the East Bay. The appellation itself starts on top of the Dublin Ridgeline about 7 miles from the San Francisco Bay and runs east about 25 miles to the Altamont Pass. So it's a valley in the Coast Range on the east side of the San Francisco Bay, and in terms of travel time from San Francisco, you can get to the beginning of the valley in about 15 or 20 minutes. So it's very close in to the San Francisco Bay Area, and very typical of the coastal valleys that the closer you are to the ocean and the bay, the cooler it is. And as you gradually move away from the bay, the climate warms up with each mile. And so you can grow from cool climate varieties to warmer varieties such as Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. So we have a wonderful set of growing conditions here, and it's one of the historic wine growing regions of California, with over 50 wineries still in existence here.
So should we taste
Should
our
we?
first wine?
I'm ready.
I'm ready
That was
too.
a lot of talking without anything to wet my whistle.
Yeah, it's 5 o'clock.
So the first wine that we have is a wine called Eric Chardonnay, and it's a Livermore Valley wine from Eric's Vineyard, a Chardonnay vineyard that's actually just about 2 miles up the road from where we're sitting along the Arroyo del Valle. This is well, I should tell you a little bit about why we call it Eric Chardonnay before I get too far into the wine. As we were making Chardonnay over the years through my family's traditions, we used a lot of large tank fermentations and a lot of sur-lie aging in the larger tanks, but oak barrels back in the 1930s, 40s were very hard to come by, so it was rare that we had a lot of opportunity to have new oak, and we had a style of Chardonnay in those days that was very Chablis-like, crisp and clean and fresh, and my brother grew up loving that style of Chardonnay. And so as the Chardonnay styles evolved through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, he was constantly saying, we need to make a Chardonnay like we used to in the 50s. And so finally, his son Carl Wente, our winemaker, said, all right, Dad, I'm going to make one and I'm going to call it after you. We'll call it Eric Chardonnay, and here it is. So it's beautiful fresh Chardonnay fruit, lean, crisp, good acidity, and just a great refreshing finish.
Yeah. And this Chardonnay is planted, as my father said, just 2 miles up the road, and is all clone 4. So it's back to that heritage FPS heat-treated clone of that descendant of that Wente clone. It's very nice, crisp, refreshing, everything that you expect from a stainless steel fermented Chardonnay.
So it is no malolactic at all, 100% stainless steel fermented. The idea is to really bring forward that beautiful stone fruit and the floral qualities of the Chardonnay, while I think that it also delivers on a really elegant body. It has a texture that stays in your mouth with a great feel and a nice crisp, almost a little citrus in the finish.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing about trying to describe wines is that everybody has different words for it, but so please forgive me my words. I'm sure that lots of tasters have their own words.
Can we go a little bit more into the story of how Eric's came about?
Well, as I think that as Chardonnay styles evolved with the availability of oak barrels and more fermentations, we began to create a couple of different styles of Chardonnay, and he just always had this love for that pure, fresh Chardonnay with no malolactic, stainless steel fermented, and used to get in debates with Carl about which was the best Chardonnay, and so that pressure to just produce that clean, crisp Chardonnay stayed with Eric, and so we had a little tongue-in-cheek in the lab one day tasting wines, and everybody finally caved in, and Carl was the leader saying, okay, we're going to bottle this and we're going to call it Eric Chardonnay. So lots of fun behind it, because the great thing about making wine is that it's artistic, it's individual, it's there's no right, wrong to it, and one of the great things about Chardonnay is its ability to be adapted to different winemaking preferences and styles, so that it's so receptive to what we're going to see in this lineup of Chardonnays as we progress from 100% stainless steel, really clean, fresh Chardonnay fruit, all the way up to lovely, rich, toasty vanilla caramel characters that you get from oak. And so my brother was a purist from day one, and he's got a Chardonnay named after him.
And we also pick the Eric Chardonnay a few bricks less than on the others. So it's 20 to 21.5 bricks comparatively to our other Chardonnays, which we let hang a little bit longer to get a little bit more alcohol content, more sugar, more richness of flavor.
A little bigger body.
A little bigger body.
There's certainly a lot of love for this wine going on Twitter right now.
Awesome.
James Melendez has a question. He wants to know what your total Chardonnay production is.
Nikki, you could take that. How many acres of Chardonnay are you growing?
Oh gosh. I would say that planted in the ground, we probably have a third Chardonnay.
Yes, I would agree. So we are close to 1,000 acres of Chardonnay between the Livermore Valley and our vineyards in Arroyo Seco in Monterey County, which we haven't talked about yet, but something that we started in 1962. So we've been in Arroyo Seco quite a long time as well. So that, it's, and we actually do sell grapes to other wineries, so we do not produce 100% of the Chardonnay we grow. We have 20 to 30 other winery customers that buy our Chardonnay, as well as some of our other grapes. And that's always just been sort of a custom for us, that we've sort of been farmers first, and have always wanted to invest in vineyard and be estate grown and continue to produce wonderful grapes.
Right.
How about Morning Fog?
All right.
All right, we're going to move on to the next Chardonnay, and this is called Morning Fog. And if you were in the Livermore Valley today, you would understand, because the fog bank and the clouds have been here all day. It has been cool. It's hardly gotten out of the 60s, and it's that fog. The wind streams come straight through the Golden Gate Gap over the East Bay Hills into the Livermore Valley in a straight line, and we have one of the shortest high temperature durations in any day, and the fog bank builds up on the East Bay Hills, being pushed in by those wind streams and spills over into the Livermore Valley every night and keeps us cool almost all morning during the summer. And so we named this wine after that weather continuum, and it's a Livermore Valley Chardonnay. It's about 50% barrel fermented and malolactic and 50% stainless steel, very much like Eric's Chardonnay, and then blended together. So you're going to see a little bit of additional richness from the barrel fermentation and the malolactic, creating a little bit of that buttery note. A little bit of vanilla and caramel from the medium toast barrels that we use, and that nice acidity and crispness and stone fruit that you get from the stainless steel portion of the Chardonnay. So yeah, I think it's a beautifully balanced wine. And quite a contrast to Eric's Chardonnay, both Livermore Valley, and a perfect example of the adaptability of Chardonnay to be turned into different styles by intention, I guess.
We actually have a couple of delayed questions on Eric's.
Okay.
So why don't we step back just a little bit? Lots of commentary still coming in on Eric's Chardonnay, so maybe we moved on a little bit too quickly. Everyone's loving the purity of fruit. James Melendez has another question. How might the wine taste if it were neutral oak versus stainless steel on the Eric's?
It would be fairly similar if it was neutral oak, or let's say third or fourth use, so that the flavors have been absorbed by previous uses. And in fact, growing up, we used to have a lot of larger oak cooperage. In other words, oak tanks and redwood tanks that were anywhere from 2,000 gallons up to 20,000 gallons that were neutral wood, prior to the invention or the affordability of stainless steel as a wine tank. So we always used to use large wood, and it was neutral wood. So it would be, and the wines were very much the same. So you get a little bit more oxygen exchange with large wood, but not a lot, because the larger the tank, the slower percentage exchange you're going to get. So the only thing that the neutral wood would do is probably speed up a little bit of the oxidative breathing process, and may create a little bit more of that what would you call it, caramel oxidative aroma.
And we do put some small portion of Eric's into concrete as well. So it is getting some of that oxygen through the porous concrete. So probably neutral oak would be pretty similar to concrete without any minerality that some people perceive after concrete aging.
Another question?
Yeah, there's a couple actually. Mary Orland would like to know, can you talk about the soils for your estate Chardonnays? She gets a strong minerality in all of them. And then there were a couple of here's on that.
You want to take that?
Well, our soils in Livermore range from very gravelly, sandy loams to more of a sandy loam. It's
and a little bit of rocky clay loam, but
Yeah.
a lot of rock in almost all of the soils, because our vineyards are right along two arroyos or creeks that have meandered around the valley over the eons, and so we're right in between them, and they've put gravel deposits and rocks and sand throughout the clays and loams that are the sort of filler. So they're all well drained, and we tend to put the Chardonnay where there's just a little bit more clay content than the pure Livermore gravel series, which is, we find, a little better for the Bordeaux varieties. But so we like a little bit of loam to clay in the Chardonnay, but it still has quite a bit of rock and minerality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we typically have the Chardonnay on Positas loam or Pleasanton loam. So it's a great soil type for the Chardonnay. They tend to be very happy plants in that, and much happier than the Cabernet. So we like to put that Cabernet and Sauv Blanc in the really well-drained soils.
Okay. Now we talked about soils. Now let's talk about winds. We have a question from inside the house. Jeff Kralik would like to know, speaking of winds, he noticed that they were quite strong today, and he would know, he's a cyclist. Is that normal? And what kind of effect does such strong winds have on the vines?
Well, we do have fairly strong winds, fairly consistent all the time. So we, as I mentioned earlier, the valley is, being in the East Bay, is really a west to east oriented valley, and lined up with the wind stream gaps in the Dublin Gap and the Mission Gap near Fremont. So we have two streams through the Golden Gate Gap and the San Bruno Gap at the Pacific Ocean that come whistling through here and go over the Altamont Pass. And for those of you who have been in the Livermore Valley, on the east side of the valley is called the Altamont area of the Diablo Range, and it is one of the largest wind farms in the world. And that's not there for lack of wind. In other words, there's a reason why that's there. And so the Central Valley, the San Joaquin and Sacramento valleys are quite a bit warmer, and as those valleys heat up during the spring and summer months, the hot air rises, and it's like a vacuum sucking the cold air in off the Pacific Ocean over the bay and through the Livermore Valley. And so we usually, once we hit a peak high of about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, we start cooling about 5 minutes after the San Francisco airport hits its peak high. So that wind stream just comes flowing straight from the San Bruno and Golden Gate gaps right into the Livermore Valley. So we have very short high temperature range and a much cooler afternoon because of it, and then colder temperatures at night.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know what a wind farm is, like I didn't know what that was but I only know because I live here. It's windmills all over. They're littered everywhere on the hillside, and definitely something that we see on a regular basis. We have wind pretty much every afternoon, and he likes to remind me of that. He's having my wedding at his house, and he always is like, oh, it's going to be cold out here. Lots of wind.
Cold and windy.
Thanks for the reminder.
Yeah. Yeah, we always laugh. There's probably, I don't know, 10 or 15 nights a year that you can sit outside and have a barbecue here, and the rest are too cold. It's not a great outdoor dining.
Except for at our restaurant.
Yeah, where you're protected from the wind.
Okay, a couple follow-up questions. Would you say that wind is an important part of the terroir? And I think you kind of just touched on this, but do you have a large diurnal swing in temperatures where the Chardonnays grow in particular? I
do think the wind is an important part of the terroir in that it is the sort of cooling element that brings the fog and keeps the temperatures moderated. But that is sort of the dividing line in all of the coastal valleys between the marine or Mediterranean climate zones and continental climate. And so as your dominant climatic influence fades as you move away from the ocean, is sort of the end of your coastal valley. So that wind is really key in keeping the daily temperatures within moderation, and then also quite key in making the cooler temperatures at night. So we have a very large diurnal differential in this valley. So those are two very important things, and very typical, as we said earlier, that it's much cooler the closer you are to the bay, and gets warmer as you go over that 20 miles, very much like you would expect from Carneros in the Napa Valley to St. Helena. We probably don't have any place as warm in this valley as Calistoga is, as an example.
Okay, going back to the morning fog, why did you decide to include Gewürztraminer?
That is in the Riva.
Oh, in the Riva.
Yes. So we don't grow Gewürztraminer in Livermore, but we do grow it in Monterey. So we can go back to that question, or I can just answer now. I think it just did something really special to the Riva Ranch. It adds a little bit more fruit, a little bit more floral.
And it's in a very small percentage.
It's 2%, right?
It's just a little fun tweak to create a little beautiful floral blossom, little sort of orange blossom character to it.
And then on the morning fog, we don't have that luxury. Just kidding.
Okay, quick history question for Phil.
Yes.
This comes from Michael Servin in Santa Barbara, and he says, this is probably a tough question, but where do you feel Wente falls within the pantheon of California wines and wineries and the history of California wine?
That's a big question.
Quick question.
Yeah, that's a very quick question. So I think that the first thing I'd like to say is that I always have felt that that our family was very humble, and that I don't try to blow my horn about. It's nice to have history, but history basically only is as good as your last glass of wine. So as long as you're enjoying my wine and like to hear a little history, it's great. We certainly were survivors as a family. My great-grandfather came here to make a living and put food on the table and raise a family. And back in the 1880s, nobody thought about winemaking as something that was going to be rich and famous or movie stars or any of those things. It was part of life. It was like growing wheat and grain and having a business. So we were able to survive. We have had a lot of firsts, from initiating varietal labeling, first Chardonnays, first Sauvignon Blancs, first Pinot Blancs. We've maintained and grown a Chardonnay selection that has been embraced by other growers in the state, to where, as Nikki mentioned, that nearly 80% of the Chardonnay originates from our vineyards. So I'd say there's quite a bit of influence in the history of California wine industry that's come from the Wente family. Yet it makes me blush talking about it, so I still want to be humble about it, that there are a lot of other great pioneers out there as well, and I highly respect them. And it was a collaborative effort. It was people working together. It was forming the Wine Institute and the Wine Advisory Board, and fighting for the ability to have our products sold in all 50 states. And it wasn't an easy battle. When Prohibition ended, it was a mess. And surviving that, getting people to believe that California could actually make good wine again, was a struggle, because most all of the premium varieties, save a few, had been pulled out for shipping table grapes. And it was one of the heritage things that happened for Wente, was that we were able to continue producing all our wine during Prohibition and maintain our vineyards. So when repeal came, we had Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon, and we're able to go back into production and maintain.
Okay, that was a good, quick answer to a very...
Sorry, it was probably a little longer
No,
than they wanted.
Okay, another question from inside the house. How much of the Chardonnay is handpicked? And then this is another big question that requires maybe a shorter response, but how are you planning for the ever-decreasing labor pool?
I will let Nikki take both of those.
So for our Chardonnays, we do try and mechanize as much as possible. We've been purchasing new machines with selective processing to try and clean up our picks, as well as the fruit that we're getting through. So it's kind of spitting out everything that isn't a perfect berry. And people have been using these selective processing heads in wineries for years to help them sort through their
Great clusters.
Yeah, clusters, excuse me, sorry. So they've been using those for years, and now they've been able to add those to harvesters, which makes our lives a lot easier and the winemaking team's lives a lot easier, so that they can even double sort if they so choose. We do hand pick a bit of our fruit, but I'd say we're doing more in Monterey than in the Livermore Valley, because we do have some old trellising systems. Some stuff in Monterey is planted since 1964. So Those ones are quadrilateral, on the ground, growing monsters. They're huge and are not able to be mechanically harvested. But for the most part, we are now planting vineyards with the intent of mechanical harvesting. We do have some small blocks that we pay special attention to, and a lot of those are going into our higher priced bottles, like this Nth Degree here that we'll get to in a bit. But for our
And it is handpicked.
it is handpicked, yes.
Right.
The Nth Degree is handpicked. But for the most part, we do work towards mechanization, and that is because of the labor crisis that all agricultural entities are going through right now. So the best thing that we're doing to plan for that labor shortage is setting up our vineyards appropriately to be mechanically operated. And with the way that the machines are changing, they're a lot more gentle. You're getting a lot higher quality fruit that comes through rather than sticks, leaves, everything in between.
We actually have some really fun internal debates and do some experiments where we've demonstrated that you cannot taste the difference between hand-picked Chardonnay and machine harvested Chardonnay these days.
Right.
Both are excellent. Where we, as Nikki said, where we do handpick is primarily because it's inefficient for the machines, or they're very small, tiny blocks, or that we're trying to selective pick some berries for very intense Chardonnays style-wise. So.
Right, yeah. And a little off topic from Chardonnay, but we did just do a trial with the selective head and a non-selective head on Zinfandel last year, and then tasted the difference between two mechanically harvested, same block, selective versus non-selective, and 6 out of 9 picked the selective as the better tasting wine. So, I mean, you're never going to get 100%, but
And that's, yeah, almost to the point of not significant. So
6 out of 9, I think that's pretty good. 3 people. Yeah, it's a small sample group.
small sample group.
We haven't done that with Chardonnay, though.
Another good question is, do you two ever have disagreements at work? And if so, how are those disagreements resolved, since you guys do work together?
No, I never disagree with him. This is my idol.
It's
He's always right.
I would turn it around the other way and say that we try to have a very collaborative environment where we allow lots of opinions in, and generally by the time, I mean, we have regular team meetings and we bring everything out on the table. Everybody gets to chime in, and so it's rarely we avoid putting people in a situation where it's one against the other.
Great. Let's talk about Riva Ranch, but before we totally move away from Morning Fog, let's talk about kind of the national availability of these two wines in particular.
The Morning Fog and the Riva Ranch, we are distributed in all 50 states, and in many cases in a small way, with small distributors and limited availability, but it is able to be found in all 50 states, both our Morning Fog and our Riva Ranch, so that I'm proud of. So as we go to Riva Ranch, back in the late 1950s, after World War II, the Bay Area really exploded in population, businesses. Many of the wonderful wine growing areas like the Santa Clara Valley all around San Jose, from Woodside all the way around to Fremont, were transformed from agriculture, orchards, vineyards into cities. And the Livermore Valley was going through the same transition, being very close in to the San Francisco Bay Area, only a 20-30 minute drive from San Jose and Oakland. So we had huge development pressure. A lot of the vineyards were torn out for housing developments, and the zoning laws at the time were not set up to protect or give agriculture any advantage. So my grandfather and father began to look for where we might go if we were forced out. If we were the last man standing, where would we want to go? And so they did a fairly extensive tour of the state numerous times, looking at areas that were far enough away from urban centers that you would have a fairly long horizon. And they, after looking at the North Coast and Central Coast, they settled on an area in Monterey County in the Salinas Valley, on the west side of the Salinas Valley, in the mouth of the Arroyo Seco River, where the Arroyo Seco River comes out of the Santa Lucia Mountains and meets the Salinas River. And they found this beautiful piece of ground that had a lot of similarities to what they were used to farming here, with a lot of river gravel, sand, silt, and stones from the Arroyo Seco River having meandered over this ranch over the centuries. And so they were able to buy this ranch in 1962 from the Riva family. And we were fortunate in that they were wonderful people, and my father hired them to stay on and run the operation, and we do their family the honor of naming the ranch, the vineyard, after them, and thus the name Riva, which is from the original family that owned the property. So as we get into the Riva Ranch, it's a much really a single vineyard size area. It is about a mile in diameter across the vineyard. So it's a what I would call a single mesoclimate where the climate of the grapes is all very similar. We're focused on Chardonnay, Pinot Noir. It's in the Greenfield to Soledad area of the Salinas Valley, which also is quite windy and cool. And so it's adjacent to the Santa Lucia Highlands and across from the Chalone area on the east side of the valley. So give you an orientation, about 20 to 25 miles south of Salinas. So you have to get about, I don't know, 10 or 15 miles south of Salinas to get warm enough to ripen the earliest season fruit. So Arroyo Seco is sort of right in that mid-region 1 of the UC Davis climate zones, and we found it to be a wonderful area to grow Chardonnay. The Riva Ranch Chardonnay is nearly 100% barrel fermented, with a little bit of non-barrel fermented components that we use to enhance the flavors, the florals, etc. But it's also got a beautiful malolactic character to it, and it gets about 20% new oak.
Yeah, 40.
40?
Is it 40? I believe it's 40.
I'm trying to think 40 and 20 second use.
Yeah. So, and something I always like to point out that differentiates Monterey Chardonnay from Livermore and other Chardonnays is that in Livermore and Sonoma, San Luis Obispo, most other places that I've worked, Chardonnay is picked in the month of September. And what's different about Monterey is we don't start picking Chardonnay until October 1st, if not later, except for the small amount of Chardonnay we use in sparkling wine. But Chardonnay in Monterey is picked from October 1st through October 31st, and it really does.
Sometimes into November.
Sometimes into November. So it has extra hang time that Livermore, Sonoma, San Luis Obispo counties don't really see. So it definitely has a lot more fruit characteristics, which is why I think we can add that extra oak without losing all the fruit, is because it has that extra month of hang time to really develop flavors and come into its own.
So I always, and as I said earlier, everybody has their own descriptors, but for me, the Riva Ranch almost always has had this banana oil sort of quality to it, very floral, and quite a bit different fruit profile than the Morning Fog. So as you can see, the vineyards are about 120 miles apart as you go down the Central Coast, and there's just while they have the same general climatic influence, you can see the difference between sites.
There's a couple of interesting questions about Riva Ranch right now. One is about aging potential. This is coming from Nanette Eaton, who is also with us live tonight. A customer of hers had a 2003 Riva, and it was drinking well in 2018. So she wants to know a little bit more about aging potential. And then I'll group that together with a question from Mary Orlin, who said she finds it very interesting that unoaked Eric's is $30 versus $22 for the Riva Chardonnay. And would love to hear more about why, as most people think oaked Chardonnays are more expensive.
Okay, well, let's take on the Riva question first.
For me, aging potential is bottle to bottle. Some bottles are going to age really well and it's going to be beautiful and you'll be very happy, and then others, the cork might have a little bit, or might be a little bit more porous, and you get way too much oxygen and it didn't age as nice. So it's wonderful when you get one of those 2003s that you can open now and it's delicious, and that's incredible. But I don't know how often that would happen, and that's kind of up to the cork, the way that you're aging it. If you're keeping it in a nice cold cellar, obviously the potential is going to be greater to have it for a longer period of time. For me, I like to drink Chardonnays. I probably wouldn't even try and keep it longer than 2008, drinking 10 years later, and that'd probably be my limit, just because I love Chardonnay and I want to taste the fresh fruit, and I really enjoy having it. But it is always interesting to see how it does age and how long you can keep it and still have a really beautiful bottle. But what do you think?
I would chime in and say certainly the older you get, there's quite a bit of bottle variation. I think Nikki's right, and then when it comes to the question of aging, it's really personal preference. So people have to understand or develop a sense of when the wine reaches a flavor that suits their palate the best. And the only way you're going to know that is to keep a reasonable amount of any vintage and try it every now and then, because if you keep one bottle and you have a 2003 and you go to it, you're just flipping a coin as to whether or not it might be good. I don't recommend that. So if you're going to age wine and seriously know or understand that you like more of the age characters, which tend to be more of the earthy spectrum than the fruit and floral spectrums, because as any wines age, they lose their fruitiness and they gain their earthiness, and so you have to pick those points that you think are your key factors that make you like it, and keep enough to try it so that when it gets to the place you like, drink it all. Don't let it go beyond. It's such a shame.
Talking like a true salesman, don't buy one bottle, buy 12.
But this is my favorite saying, if you put one bottle of something away in your cellar, it's a pet. The only reason you have that bottle is to go down in your cellar and go, oh, look at my 1997 something or other. You have no idea whether that's good, bad, or indifferent.
That actually leads perfectly into the next question from James Melendez, who wants to know, actually, then, what is the oldest pet in your cellar when it comes to Chardonnay?
He has pets. He has pets, you guys.
I have some pets just because I am a history buff and I like to have various vintages sitting there on my shelf, but I do only have one or two bottles of various things. I have some from the late 1930s, early 1940s, and most of them are lucky to still have liquid. They're very brown. I don't think they're anything you'd want to drink, but it's fun to see the labels, look at the history, remind yourself. I would think that somewhere around 20 years is probably the oldest Chardonnay I've had that from Wente that I thought was still really enjoyable. And more of what Nikki was saying, it was bottle to bottle variation. A few bottles were still remarkably good, and but you also have to accept that they really transitioned to that very almost sherry-like nutty character more than the Chardonnay you think you're buying. So, I like sherry. It's very drinkable.
I actually got a bottle of, I think it was 41 Chardonnay from Carl for Christmas. this past year. So I'm not going to drink it. That's a pet for sure, but it's the oldest thing in my cellar. I don't have a cellar.
So I jump back in and say the other thing I love about the Riva Ranch is the texture. And I'm a big texture enjoyer. I love the feel of wine in my mouth. I love that richness and the fullness, and it you know, I always tell people, so if you don't really understand texture, think of whipping cream versus water. So whipping cream has huge texture, coats your mouth, and water is very thin and goes and it just disappears. So this has a huge amount of that whipping cream texture. It is big, rich, luscious, and it's fun to just hold it in your mouth.
So Dezel Quillen has a great question from Virginia. Consumers who say they do not like Chardonnay, in reality, usually do not like a certain style of Chardonnay. Since you cover a wide range of styles, do you find customers changing their mind and perception of Chardonnay in your tasting room? I'm sure you do all the time, but had to ask.
Yes. and in my friends, and when we go out to dinner at restaurants, and every opportunity I have to show. How many times have we've all heard somebody say, I don't really like Chardonnay, and the first thing I say is, you haven't tried our Chardonnay.
Yeah.
And I talk to them a little bit and listen to what they like, and then I can pour them an Eric's or a Morning Fog, or and most of the time it's pushback on the heavier Chardonnays or the bigger oaky Chardonnays, and I try to explain to them why they're like that they are to sip and enjoy, to chew, to let the flavors blossom. But that Chardonnay can also be a beautiful, light, crisp beverage that you don't have to take a lot of notice. You can just enjoy it. So yes, we get a lot of conversion at the tasting room, and yes, I'm a missionary. Now, that said, I love Sauvignon Blancs, I love Pinot Gris, I love Pinot Blanc, I love Viognier, I love Semillons, Rieslings, Gewürztraminers. I think people should enjoy all white wine. We are in a little bit of a dominant Chardonnay society, but I also think that Chardonnay, as we were saying, can be all these different styles. So it's really like 5 or 6 wines in one.
Yeah.
Which brings us to N.
And
Yeah. I was going to say that I converted my fiance, so you can do that, anything's possible.
I think he had to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, don't you think he had to do some long, hard thinking? I'm going to let you describe the imp.
But I'm not as good as you.
What vineyard is it from?
So the nth is partially from one of our heritage blocks that has been the process that we were talking about earlier that Ernest had instilled in all of us, the selection process of going through, finding the vines that are really outstanding in flavor and structure, and replanting. So one of those blocks, we have 4 right now, 4 heritage selection blocks on property, and one of those in particular goes into this glass of wine here, the Nth Degree. And it's also blended with a block that is Clone 4, planted in the Carl Vineyard, named after my grandfather and my dad's father. So it's kind of a marrying of 2 different flavor profiles. I mean, the heat treatment, what it does to the heritage, because Clone 4 is a descendant of that heritage selection, but the heat treatment really normalizes everything. So what I mean by that is it gets rid of virus, it gets rid of any issues within the vine, and it standardizes everything. So the flavors are typically the same vine to vine, whereas in our heritage selection, you can go and taste a pear on one vine and a green apple on the other and a peach almost on one and muscat flavors on the next. So it's different, and they're both very special and unique in their own ways, and the marrying of the 2 really creates something extra special. And we do put more oak on this. I don't know if it's all French, I believe.
It's all French, and it's a significant, and like 80% new, 20% neutral or used.
Yeah, second and third use.
Right. So you definitely can get more toast, more, the barrels are a little heavier char. There's a little more smoke in it. The oak really comes up in the finish. It keeps blossoming in your mouth. But it also still has that nice
Presence of fruit.
acidity,
Yeah.
crispness that I think you find in the Erics. And almost a little citrus on the finish again because of that. So it's a very intense set of different flavors in there that you can see a progression from Eric's to the Morning Fog to the Nth Degree of 3 different Livermore Valley Chardonnays that style-wise are quite different. You wouldn't mistake one for the other.
If you could really summarize it, what's the core difference between how you vinify Nth Degree versus Riva?
So, well, the Nth Degree comes from very specific vineyard blocks, hand harvested, all of that. Definitely see more by hand passes throughout the season on these specific blocks. They were hand selected by my cousin Carl, who really saw potential not only in our heritage but also in the Carl Ranch block. And I mean, the oak profile is definitely different. We use both American and French in the Riva Ranch, and in the Nth Degree, we're solely using the French oak in there.
Probably twice as much new barrels, a little bit, quite a few heavier toast in the barrels, so a little bit more of the smoky element. Again, it is Arroyo Seco versus Livermore Valley, so different fruit profiles.
Yeah.
The Nth Degree is picked a little bit riper, striving even for a little bit higher alcohol balance in it. What else can we say? That it's probably stirred a little bit longer on the lees, and
Yes.
Does the Nth Degree usually come from the same vineyards, or do you make that selection after it goes after harvest?
That's a good question. It typically does come from the same vineyards year after year. We do have some new vineyards that came into production within the last 5 years that really are showing well from all of the analysis that we run every year on every block. So the blocks can change. It's not that they're not subject to change. It's just that these blocks have performed well year after year. And we don't just think like, oh, that's going to, well, when we're farming it, we do think like, oh, this performed well last year. We're going to continue to farm this very to the Nth degree, as we say. But we do continue to monitor quality on all of our vineyards. And we, at the end of the year, we have a harvest hot wash, what we call, and we go through everything and see what changes we need to make and if we should be paying attention to a section of a different block to try and change things up, or if we're like, wow, this block outperformed everything by far, we should be hand picking that, we should be thinning, we should be or thinning to a greater extent, we should be doing all this other work because it really could perform to a really high degree. And we do see that quite often, more often in reds than whites. We really love those blocks because we do like that heritage in there. It really does add some special.
so sort of picking up on that theme, that certainly with the Nth Degree, it's not locked into a block, but we usually make a decision, and we have been fairly consistent on the blocks in the last few years. But when you make a decision to farm something for a specific program, and there was a question earlier about the difference in costs of the wine, whether it's oak barrel or not oak barrel, Eric's, I guess, versus Riva or Nth.
We didn't answer that one.
The way that I like to talk about what is the difference in farming is, if you think about what quality really is ultimate uniformity in the vineyard on the day of harvest. And so to the extent, if you walk out in the vineyard at harvest and you pick a perfectly ripe grape and put it in your mouth, the flavors are amazing. Wow, intense, perfect, everything you want. The problem is, how do I get every other berry in the vineyard to be like that one today? Because nobody can individually taste and pick berry by berry, so you sort of have to make judgment calls. But what farming can do is narrow the windows of the uniformity. So where if you really want to spend time making a vineyard as uniform as possible, you make all the shoots the same length early on. You narrow the bloom window, so you take away the first 10% of bloom and the last 10% of bloom, because then those sets will all be closer together. If it's a red wine at veraison, you will get rid of the first 10% and the last 10% and narrow that window. With a white grapes, you'll look at them and look at the ones that are going through the same process and get rid of any late ripening or really early ones. So by the end of it, you're going to have eliminated 40 to 50% of the grapes in the vineyard if you're really looking for a very uniform product, and you're going to get that ripeness down to probably, if not one day, a 2 or 3 day window where all the grapes are going to be pretty close to the same ripeness. But it's also cost an enormous amount of money to get there. Passes, labor, loss of crop, but you created a much more uniform, intense consistency.
Yeah. So like I was alluding to with the nth degree, it's a lot more passes, a lot more cultural practices that we do to kind of elevate that wine. And that's why the price of the Eric's is more expensive than the Riva, even though there's a lack of oak barrel, because we do have a lot more cultural practices as a small lot wine that Eric's is. Sold mostly from our tasting room into a select on-premise accounts.
Exactly.
We are going through this specific vineyard because it is a single vineyard wine. So we only have one vineyard to go through. We pick the best spot that we want to focus these cultural practices to make the vineyard as uniform as possible, so we know exactly what we're getting, and can kind of manipulate the flavor profile that we're getting from the ground, literally the ground up.
One last question on Inth before we move on. What would be your ideal food pairing with this wine? And then I'm going to couple that with the next question, which is that if you could pick only one Chardonnay that defines Wente Vineyards, what would that be? And maybe that can transition into the final wine and the tasting.
Well, so two things. I love the questions about food pairings because it just suggests imagination and how everybody. So for me, I think this nth degree would be unbelievable with a fillet of sole done with garlic butter, nth degree poured on it, a little lemon, some capers. Now, I could also see having it with fettuccine Alfredo.
Yeah, I was gonna say pasta, so like a nice fresh pasta with vegetables, maybe shrimp.
Yeah, so imagination.
Yeah. And maybe some red pepper flakes. Get a little spice in there.
Okay, so if you could only pick one Chardonnay that defines the portfolio, what would that be?
Well, I think I'm going to say the 135th because it is a mix of Arroyo Seco and Livermore. I feel like that's a good answer.
She's getting to be so perfectly. So let's jump right into that with that, because this is something very special and new. I've only had the opportunity to taste it a couple of times on its way to the bottle. We are celebrating our 135th anniversary. I think that's pretty special. And we decided that we should really have a Chardonnay that celebrates our 135th anniversary. And we've sort of, I don't know if this can be seen, but we've sort of taken the label back to the label that my great uncle Herman and my grandfather Ernest had right after Prohibition, just as sort of a fun throwback in time.
Yeah.
So tell us about the wine, Nikki.
So this is, I believe, 40% Monterey Arroyo Seco and 60% Livermore Valley. So it is kind of a really great representation of who we are, our sense of place, because that is a sense of place is really something that we focus on in winemaking and viticultural practices. Is we want our wines to taste like where they came from. So I think this does a really great job of kind of combining that Monterey fruit with the Livermore. We also want it to be varietal topistic, so it does taste like Chardonnay because it is Chardonnay. And then we really do want to have the quality shine through. So I think that this glass of wine really does it. I've only had a few opportunities to taste it too. I did
Yeah, so this is
snag a
fun.
bottle, but I haven't opened it yet. It has beautiful fruit expression. It isn't hindered by any oak. You can just go straight through to the fruit. I personally love oak, but I know other people that are not too big of a fan, and I think this does a great, it's mellow, it's not overly acidic, so it does have that nice creaminess, full mouthfeel, but not overpowering by any means.
And I was just referring to the notes because I'm, again, only had the opportunity to be introduced to this wine a few times. It is predominantly American oak, some neutral oak, and a little bit of French. And it's been aged 16 months. So it does come through with some pretty good toasty, smoky, some good, caramel toast in it, and a nice body.
And Jeff Kralik over here says, I see this is a 2016. How far in advance did you start planning for the 135th? I can barely plan my wardrobe for tomorrow. I think we can all relate. So, yeah.
Well, one of the things that we have learned over the years is that you never want to miss an opportunity to celebrate. And they just go by too quick. So we do kind of nudge ourselves that, hey, 135 is something to celebrate. We'll probably have to celebrate 140.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and something we often do is we don't blend everything right away. So we have a lot of stuff separated that we're tasting and we're like, wow, this is something special. Could we do something with this? What could we do? And that's what's wonderful. Excuse me, too much wine. There's 5 glasses here. That's what's wonderful about having tasting rooms is we can come out with a 1-year thing that our winemaking team tried something new and they really loved. And it happens more often than you think. God, we have so many SKUs. The marketing team tries to get on us about that. But and here we are creating more because we love what we do and we're here because we want to be here. And that's why we got 135 years under our belt.
Well, that's why it's fun to make wine. And to be able to sit in a collaborative situation and bounce ideas off of other winemakers and kind of play and blend and develop flavors and characteristics and debate whether a little more oak or a little less or a little more acidity or a little less works. And I think they're wonderful creations. So I hope everybody's enjoyed them.
Yeah.
Everyone's really enjoying them, and particularly this one. What else do you have planned to celebrate the big 135?
So
Well-
there is a celebration planned in July, I believe on the 21st?
20th.
20th of July.
Okay, 20th of July. And we honestly plan on celebrating our 135 by making it another 135. So hopefully we won't be here for that. But,
Oh, I'd love
but
to
you
be
never
here
know.
for that. But,
Modern medicine.
we haven't made that wine yet that will give me another 135, but it could happen.
You never know.
Yeah. So we invite all of you to come out on July 20th and celebrate with us for
Yeah.
135 years and have some Chardonnay as well as some of our other wonderful wines.
Yeah, well, July 20th and every other day. This year, next year, every year. Come on out.
One last wine-related question,
Good.
and that is, what is next for Wente Vineyards? There's questions about PetNat. I know you're already doing some sparkling. What's kind of next on the wine front?
Well, I actually would say that we don't have anything that is spectacularly different, but really more of focus on continuing to have our vineyards really be in great shape, constantly rotating 100 acres or so in and out every year and staying estate grown. But Nikki, as fifth generation, may have something new and fun on the horizon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that every year we focus on continual improvement, and that's not to say that we weren't doing it right before, but we are a family that believes in education and investment in the future, and every year we're going to continue to work on the vineyards and continue working on our winemaking practice and hone in on all of the different wines that we can continue to produce on a high quality level, and that's kind of my excitement. Hopefully I can make some wine someday too, right, Dad?
Absolutely.
With your help.
Absolutely. And I would say that we also want to be very focused on listening to our consumers. We're not making wines just for ourselves. So we're open and receptive to ideas and styles and what people like. So.
Okay, and then the last question that's not wine related is coming from the very, very lost man from Houston in here right now. Warriors or Rockets?
Warriors.
Silly
Go
question.
Rockets.
Warriors.
If I didn't say Warriors, I'd be disloyal. I mean, here we are right next to Oakland, and
Fear the beard.
we are afraid of the beard. But,
Very afraid.
yeah. But I like a little curry with my wine.
Great. Okay.
Thank you
Bye,
guys so much
everybody.
for joining us. We really appreciate it. And here's to Chardonnay, raising a glass to you and to Chardonnay itself. Thank you, Ernest, raising a glass
Yeah,
to you
thank you,
for
Ernest.
everything that you've done for us. And cheers.